We are officially looking down the barrel of one of the most terrifying deadlines in history. In just a matter of hours, the president's 8 o'clock ultimatum is going to expire, and the level of absolute uncertainty ripping through the global markets is completely unprecedented. If you look back at recent history, this specific pressure cooker strategy from the administration actually feels incredibly familiar. Because when massive, crippling tariffs were threatened against foreign competitors, or when the president shocked the world by threatening to physically invade Greenland, European leaders and geopolitical rivals almost immediately scrambled to the negotiating table to desperately work out a diplomatic deal. The entire geopolitical strategy coming out of the White House has always been based on maximum, overwhelming pressure, operating on the assumption that if you squeeze a foreign adversary hard enough and threaten them with total destruction, they will eventually break, wave the white flag, and give you exactly what you want to avoid: a catastrophic military conflict. But here is the absolutely terrifying reality about what is happening tonight in the Middle East as the clock ticks down, because Iran is absolutely not folding, and every single piece of intelligence indicates that they have zero intention of backing down or compromising before that 8 o'clock deadline strikes. Instead of scrambling to the negotiating table to save their domestic infrastructure from a massive American bombing campaign, the Iranian government just made a calculated massive display of absolute defiance by officially and completely cutting off all direct diplomatic communications with the United States, effectively unplugging the red phone, refusing to take the calls, and freezing all indirect back-channel talks. United States intelligence officials are openly stating that this was a deliberate, highly calculated signal from Tehran designed to send a message of complete disapproval and unwavering defiance right in the face of the American military, proving that they are not intimidated by the apocalyptic rhetoric coming out of Washington. Because the threat issued by the President of the United States was not just a standard military warning about taking out a few radar installations, as he explicitly stated on Truth Social that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, threatening to systematically wipe out every single civilian power plant and bridge in the country. That is the kind of apocalyptic, overwhelming rhetoric that usually forces a smaller nation to immediately beg for a ceasefire. But Iran's response to that existential threat was to simply walk away from the negotiating table entirely, leaving the United States backed into a massive geopolitical corner of its own making. And to prove that Washington is absolutely dead serious about this timeline and willing to pull the trigger, the United States military just executed one of the most devastating high-value strikes of the entire conflict by launching a massive direct attack on Iran's Kharg Island right as the deadline rapidly approaches. If you do not closely follow Middle Eastern energy logistics, you might not realize how massive that specific target actually is, because Kharg Island is not just a random piece of rock sitting out in the Persian Gulf. It is the absolute, undisputed beating heart of the entire Iranian energy economy. This single, heavily fortified island processes a staggering 90% of all Iranian physical oil exports, meaning that 90% of the physical energy revenue that keeps their government functioning flows through that one specific location. And the United States military just dropped the hammer on it to send a violent message. The Pentagon is showing Tehran that they have the exact coordinates to dismantle their economy piece by piece, and they are perfectly willing to pull the trigger on a much wider scale if a peace deal is not reached tonight. But despite losing their most critical oil processing hub, Iran's negotiators are remaining completely pessimistic. Major news outlets are reporting that there is almost zero hope that Iran will bend to meet the president's demands, which means the White House is now completely paving the way for an unprecedented escalation of this war as the United States military actively prepares to launch a massive coordinated bombing campaign. We are now staring at a terrifying game of geopolitical chicken, where neither side has any brakes installed, especially considering the President of the United States has already delayed this exact ultimatum 4 separate times in the past, hoping that Iran would finally crack under the immense pressure. But if the President moves this deadline for a 5th time, he completely loses all remaining geopolitical leverage, signaling to the entire world that the United States is terrified of actually following through on its own threats, which effectively forces Washington to either launch the most devastating bombing campaign of the 21st century tonight, or watch its global military authority collapse. As the clock ticks down, the anticipation is completely suffocating the global intelligence community because everyone is bracing for what could easily become the most eventful, catastrophic day of this entire war. And to truly understand why this diplomatic standoff has completely collapsed, you have to look at the actual demands currently sitting on the table. The United States originally presented a massive 15-point peace plan designed to completely neutralize Iran as a regional threat. But instead of accepting those terms, Iran just delivered a highly anticipated, completely unapologetic 10-point counteroffer that proves they are negotiating like a country that believes they hold all the cards. First and foremost, Iran is demanding an absolute ironclad guarantee that they will never be attacked by American forces again, establishing a permanent, finalized end to the entire war, rather than a fragile ceasefire, along with an immediate halt to all Allied military strikes happening in Lebanon and the lifting of all American economic sanctions. But here's where their counteroffer goes from bold to absolutely downright extortion, because in exchange for reopening the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping, Iran is demanding a massive financial ransom, officially proposing a mandatory toll of $2 million for every single commercial ship that passes through the strait. They're demanding $2 million per vessel just to access the most critical energy choke point on the entire planet, and they have explicitly stated that this massive pile of extorted toll money will not be used for war reparations, but rather to completely fund their own domestic reconstruction. They are literally demanding that the Western world pay to rebuild the exact same Iranian infrastructure that American bunker busters just destroyed, which is a masterclass in geopolitical audacity and a deal that the White House will absolutely never accept, leaving the diplomatic channels frozen and the red phone unplugged as Kharg Island goes up in flames. Washington is now staring at a clock that is rapidly counting down to the 8 o'clock deadline, marking the exact moment where the unstoppable force of the American military meets the immovable object of Iranian defiance, and the physical reality of the global supply chain hangs entirely in the balance. But if you think the standoff over the Strait of Hormuz is the only geopolitical nightmare unfolding tonight as the clock ticks down, you need to look slightly to the southwest, directly toward the waters of the Red Sea, because Iran has just officially put a second massive global choke point right into their military crosshairs by officially threatening to completely shut down the Bab al-Mandeb Strait if the situation gets out of control. And with the president's 8 o'clock deadline rapidly approaching, the situation is the very definition of out of control. Let us actually break down the physical reality of what losing the Bab al-Mandeb Strait would mean for the planet, because this is not just a minor shipping lane used for regional trade in the Middle East. It is the physical gateway that connects the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea and accounts for roughly 12% of all global seaborne trade, handling the physical flow of 6 to 8 million barrels of daily oil supply that the global markets are completely unprepared to lose in a simultaneous closure of both Hormuz and the Red Sea. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is making absolutely sure that everyone understands the stakes tonight, issuing a terrifying public statement responding directly to the president's threat to bomb their infrastructure, stating that if the United States follows through and targets Iranian civilian power plants, they will not hesitate to violently retaliate and plunge the entire region into complete darkness, specifically calling out Saudi Arabia and threatening to destroy the physical energy grids of American allies in a move that would rapidly mutate a localized conflict into a total region-wide infrastructure war. The sheer panic this apocalyptic rhetoric is causing in the physical energy markets is completely breaking the charts right now, because as the countdown continues, United States crude oil prices have violently surged past $117 a barrel, detaching completely from normal economic reality as buyers panic over the deadline and leading models warn about the catastrophic domestic consequences of this massive price spike hitting the American consumer directly at the gas pump and bleeding into the cost of transporting every single physical good across the country. If physical crude oil simply stays at these current elevated levels for just 7 more weeks, macroeconomic analysts are heavily projecting that physical United States consumer price index inflation will violently rise to a crippling 3.7% by the end of May. But that projection assumes the Red Sea actually remains open, meaning if Iran follows through on their threat to physically shut down the Bab al-Mandeb Strait tonight, geopolitical experts are warning that physical oil could easily surge to an unimaginable $150 a barrel. And if we see $150 oil hit the global markets, that physical inflation rate has a very real possibility of exceeding 4%, which would completely destroy the purchasing power of an American middle class that is already stretched to the absolute breaking point, forcing the United States government into an impossible lose-lose situation where they either let physical inflation completely devour the domestic economy or trigger a massive wave of domestic unemployment to artificially freeze the supply chains and cool the economic engine down. And honestly, the American workforce is already showing massive, terrifying signs of cracking under the pressure, because while the administration is entirely focused on bombing targets halfway across the world, the domestic employment numbers back home are quietly collapsing at a historic pace, especially in the technology sector, which has violently shed 43,000 jobs over the last year alone, marking the single biggest year-over-year drop the industry has seen since early 2024. And signaling a massive contraction in the sector that is supposed to be the undisputed engine of American economic growth. This isn't just a temporary dip in hiring, it is a sustained multi-year contraction that has seen information technology jobs plummet by 330,000 since hitting a peak in November of 2022, bringing the total number of tech workers down to 2.79 million, which is the absolute lowest level we have seen since mid-2021, literally watching tech employment drop below pre-pandemic levels and returning to numbers last seen almost a decade ago in 2016, as highly skilled jobs completely evaporate. But the massive economic bleeding is not just contained to Silicon Valley and the private technology sector, because the federal government's own domestic workforce is currently shrinking at a completely unprecedented historic pace, slashing another 18,000 jobs from its payrolls just last month to bring the total federal workforce down to 2.66 million employees, which makes it the absolute smallest. The federal workforce has been since 1966, representing the 14th consecutive month of massive job declines directly within the government itself. Since the beginning of 2025, the federal government has quietly eliminated over 352,000 jobs, completely reducing their entire workforce by nearly 12% in just over a year, meaning that as a percentage of total employment, federal jobs now account for just 1.67% of the American workforce, the lowest percentage on record in American history, creating a massive, jarring contradiction between the government's domestic collapse and its aggressive military posture abroad. Think about how this looks from the outside. With an administration preparing to launch a multi-billion-dollar bombing campaign in the Middle East, while the very government funding that war is actively eliminating hundreds of thousands of domestic jobs, creating an incredibly fragile physical economic reality back home where everyday American taxpayers are being squeezed by skyrocketing physical inflation, which is exactly why Iran is refusing to fold, calculating that the American public simply cannot afford to survive the economic fallout of a total energy blockade if both straits are shut down tonight. As the clock has essentially run out on the diplomatic negotiations, leaving the United States military standing at the edge of the most consequential escalation of the 21st century, Washington is fully prepared to execute a massive bombing campaign that would systematically dismantle Iran's civilian power plants and bridges in accordance with the president's apocalyptic threat to destroy their entire civilization. But when you actually stop and analyze the physical logistics of executing a nationwide infrastructure wipeout tonight, you realize that destroying physical bridges and power plants does not just cripple the enemy's military capacity. It completely annihilates the basic physical survival mechanisms for millions of everyday civilians, which guarantees an unprecedented, unrelenting wave of violent retaliation against every single piece of American-backed energy infrastructure across the entire Middle East. Iran has already promised that if American bunker busters start leveling their civilian power grids and infrastructure when the deadline strikes, they will plunge the entire region into absolute darkness by systematically targeting the physical energy processing facilities of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, essentially holding the physical global economy hostage to deter the United States from following through on its 8 o'clock ultimatum. And this is exactly why the sheer audacity of Iran's highly anticipated 10-point counteroffer is sending absolute shockwaves through the halls of the Pentagon right now, because instead of begging for mercy under the overwhelming threat of total destruction, Tehran is actively demanding a permanent end to the war, a complete lifting of all economic sanctions, and the immediate cessation of all allied military strikes currently taking place over in Lebanon. But the absolute centerpiece of their counterproposal, the specific demand that completely shatters any hope of a quick diplomatic resolution tonight, is their unprecedented plan to heavily tax the global supply chain by imposing a mandatory, non-negotiable physical toll of $2 million on every single commercial shipping vessel that attempts to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Try to conceptualize the catastrophic logistical nightmare of slapping a $2 million premium on every single tanker and cargo ship trying to navigate the most important waterway on Earth. Because that massive extortion fee does not just vanish into thin air, it gets immediately passed down the physical supply chain, violently inflating the cost of every single barrel of oil and every single manufactured good that makes its way to American shores. And Iran is not just keeping this massive pile of extorted shipping money for themselves, because in a brilliant, terrifying stroke of geopolitical manipulation, they have officially proposed splitting these Hormuz transit fees directly with the nation of Oman, actively attempting to bribe a traditionally neutral Gulf mediator by offering them a massive, lucrative cut of the global shipping tax. By directly cutting Oman into this massive geopolitical extortion racket, Iran is actively attempting to fracture the united front of American allies in the Middle East, essentially betting that the sheer financial temptation of splitting millions of dollars in daily shipping tolls will be enough to pull regional partners away from Washington's orbit and completely isolate the United States military in the Persian Gulf. And to add the ultimate insult to this massive logistical injury, Iran has explicitly stated that they will not use a single dime of these extorted Hormuz transit fees to pay for war reparations, boldly declaring that the entire massive revenue stream will be diverted strictly toward funding their own domestic reconstruction, essentially forcing the global economy to physically rebuild the exact same Iranian infrastructure that American forces just spent weeks destroying. This is the ultimate definition of an asymmetric geopolitical trap, because the administration's entire maximum pressure strategy was built on the fundamental assumption that a nation facing overwhelming American firepower and catastrophic economic sanctions would eventually crack, just like foreign competitors folded during the massive trade wars and tariff battles of the last few years. But the Iranian leadership looked at the escalating American threats, looked at the massive domestic job losses systematically hollowing out the United States federal government and the private technology sector back home, and calculated that the American taxpayer is simply too exhausted and too financially fragile to survive the physical economic fallout of a prolonged total blockade of the Middle East. They are weaponizing the physical fragility of the global supply chain against the political vulnerability of an administration that cannot afford to see physical crude oil spike to $150 a barrel, knowing perfectly well that if physical inflation breaches that 4% threshold, it will completely destroy the purchasing power of the American middle class right as the global economy teeters on the brink of a massive crisis. Because when you're staring at a scenario where physical oil prices dictate the absolute baseline of your entire domestic economy, the financial institutions running the country are completely paralyzed, forced to watch helplessly as energy-driven physical inflation devours the American dollar while being totally unable to enact any domestic rescue policies without violently accelerating the exact same economic collapse they are desperately trying to prevent. Which means, as we sit here watching this historic 8 o'clock deadline finally arrive, the President of the United States is essentially trapped in an unwinnable stare-down against a heavily armed adversary that has completely disconnected the red phone, shut down all diplomatic back channels, and proven they are perfectly willing to watch the entire global energy grid burn to the ground before they ever surrender to Washington's demands. So the entire world is holding its collective breath tonight, watching a fractured American superpower prepare to unleash a devastating bombing campaign against an enemy that has successfully rigged the entire physical global economy to explode the moment the first bunker buster strikes, setting the stage for a catastrophic showdown that will permanently alter the physical logistics of global trade for generations to come. And right now, the 8 o'clock deadline has officially arrived, bringing the United States and the rest of the world to the absolute edge of the geopolitical abyss, as everyone anxiously waits to see if the military is actually going to unleash a devastating wave of bunker busters against civilian power plants, or if Washington will silently back away from the apocalypse. Because the terrifying reality that is finally setting in across the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House tonight is that you simply cannot bomb your way out of a massive physical supply chain crisis when your heavily armed adversary essentially holds the detonator to the entire global energy grid. For decades, the American military has operated on the fundamental core assumption that overwhelming physical firepower, advanced drone technology, and total air superiority could easily force any rogue nation into immediate submission, allowing Washington to completely dictate the terms of global trade and forcing international rivals to accept their demands to avoid total destruction. But this massive conflict has fundamentally broken that old geopolitical playbook, because Iran successfully absorbed the devastating hits to Kharg Island and immediately pivoted to a brilliant asymmetric strategy that weaponizes the sheer fragility of the physical global economy directly against the everyday American taxpayer. When you're staring at a completely unprecedented scenario where a regional power is actively threatening to sever 12% of all global seaborne trade and physically choke off 6 to 8 million barrels of daily oil supply in the Red Sea, the traditional threats of military retaliation suddenly become completely ineffective. The administration is slowly realizing that launching another massive wave of heavy airstrikes against Iranian bridges and civilian power grids will not magically reopen the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, nor will it convince terrified shipping companies to risk sending massive commercial tankers into a heavily mined, actively contested war zone just to deliver basic commodities. And as the clock strikes 8 and the deadline officially expires, the massive economic vulnerabilities right here inside the United States are acting as an absolute anchor around the neck of the administration, paralyzing their ability to launch a full-scale regional war without entirely destroying their own domestic economy in the process. We have an American workforce that is currently enduring a catastrophic, historic hollowing out, with the federal government quietly eliminating over 352,000 jobs, while the private technology sector aggressively bleeds tens of thousands of highly skilled positions, pushing total tech employment well below pre-pandemic levels. You absolutely cannot sustain a massive, multi-trillion-dollar military campaign halfway across the world when the very domestic economic engine required to fund that war is actively contracting. leaving the everyday American taxpayer incredibly exposed to the absolute worst kind of physical economic shockwave. If the administration pushes forward with this massive escalation tonight and physical crude oil violently spikes to that unimaginable $150 threshold, the resulting wave of physical inflation will immediately exceed 4%, systematically destroying the purchasing power of an already exhausted and heavily burdened middle class. It means that the cost of the physical diesel fuel required to transport goods across the American highway system will completely double, the price of basic groceries will surge out of control, and the cost of physically operating the heavy machinery that keeps this country running will become entirely unsustainable for thousands of domestic businesses. Iran is perfectly content to sit back with the diplomatic phone lines completely severed and watch the United States government tear itself apart, trying to choose between saving its geopolitical reputation on the world stage and preventing a massive, uncontrollable wave of physical inflation from destroying the economy back home. This is the brutal, terrifying evolution of modern asymmetric warfare, where a nation that is completely outgunned on the traditional battlefield can successfully hold a massive global superpower in check simply by wrapping their arms around the physical supply chains that the entire Western world absolutely requires to survive. As we desperately wait for the official confirmation of exactly what military actions are being authorized by the Commander-in-Chief tonight under the cover of darkness, it is becoming abundantly clear that the United States has walked straight into an incredibly complex, highly dangerous trap with absolutely no viable exit strategy. I really want to hear exactly what you guys think is happening behind closed doors right now as this historic deadline passes. Do you believe the United States military is actively launching massive airstrikes against those civilian power grids? Or do you think the White House was forced to quietly back down to save the domestic economy? Drop your predictions down in the comments below because the situation is incredibly volatile and we are literally watching the entire physical global supply chain hang in the balance. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss the massive fallout tomorrow morning. Stay safe out there. Keep a very close eye on the physical price of crude oil in your local gas stations over the next 24 hours. And I will see you in the next update as we track exactly how this historic geopolitical showdown ultimately impacts the global economy.